Hello, everyone. Welcome to Roll for Crit, and thank you so much for joining us. Because today is a fantastic day. Because I've been lucky enough to be joined by a designer you may know, Cole Wehrle, who has designed such titles such as Oath and Root. Thank you so much for joining me on the channel today.
It's my pleasure, Will. Thanks for having me.
So we have you on here today because you have a new game in the works that should be coming out relatively soon called Arcs, and I wanted to talk to you about the game design behind it. But it turns out that you've actually posted everything, your game diaries on Board Geek. So goodbye, everyone. But yes, you should definitely still read those. But we're going to talk about some of the game process, some of the thoughts, probably go over some of the similar things, but also how I'm sure not only Root and Oath heavily impacted maybe some of your design thoughts and choices, but maybe some other games as well.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we actually start, just in case if someone doesn't know who you are, maybe a very quick synopsis and how you got here in the first place.
Sure. Hi. If you don't know me, I am a game designer working in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've worked in a bunch of different parts of the industry. Right now, I'm working as the creative director here at Leader Games, where I've worked on projects like Root and Oath and lots of other things. Basically, anything the studio has done in the last 4 years, I've got my hands on in one way or another. And then I also own a small historical games company with my brother called Whirly Gig, and that's where the that's where the more history grounded games go. Whereas the stuff I do at Leader Games tends to be more mainstream hobby, fantasy, science fiction, that kind of stuff. And I've been playing games all my life. Before working in the industry full time, I was a teacher. I taught Victorian literature and other subjects too in Texas. But now my family and I make our home in Minnesota, and I get to spend all my time working on games. It's lovely.
It's very interesting. I guess we'll just start there. How you say like, oh, these are my more historical games. Because after playing, in particular, at least for me, I feel like Oath is very much
Sure.
a reflection on history.
Yeah, I mean, I think my design practice it does and it doesn't change. I mean, they're all. I mean, I think about what I like to do when I'm working with fantastic settings. What I like about it is there's a really fundamental difference from that in historical games. With historic games, I'm always having to contend with the record. I have to really think about like what actually did happen. What were people at the time thinking about? What is the state of scholarship on that subject like? And I have to be. It's almost like doing an adaptation of something. I have to be like an honest documentarian. I have to really make sure that if I'm deviating from contemporary scholarship, that people know I'm deviating from it, or that I have my own grounding for the differences I might have. Now, when I'm working on a fantasy game, there are no rules about dragons, uh, and but there are still rules, and the rules that I'm interested in have to do, and I usually call this like a game's arguments, right? So, Root is stuffed full of arguments about political economy. But I don't have to worry about whether or not something I might have to say about the Huguenots is accurate to the Huguenots. I just have to make sure that the larger theories that the game is trafficking in, that they harmonize with one another. So one of the things I love about working on games in fantastic settings is I get to sort of work in a more philosophical and broader scope. I can kind of like deal with the theoretical. So, Oath is a game about history. It's a game about historiography. And one of my favorite things about it is it allows me to talk about history and historiography without boring people with like records of Byzantine tax collectors or some other group that folks the Magyars or something. And so I can talk free of context, and then I can even work to determine the game's own context. And here I'm aided so ably by Kyle Farron, who's the illustrator for all of the projects that I do at Leader Game that get done at Leader Games. And what's wonderful about working with Kyle is, he's a big reader like I am, and we talk a lot about the books that we're reading and the kind of influences, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the sort of world that we want the game to build and get to kind of shape our own context. And in contrast, when I'm working on a historical game, that context shaping is not something that I get to be in the driver's seat for. I have to just be a good reader and listener of the historical record where I can.
Well, I think that's a good place to start because if you go over a lot of the art designer diaries, I feel like one of the things that you bring up a lot is the story, the theme that it's trying to tell, not even simply to the obvious art pieces, but the mechanics. Like you talk about
Mhm.
how what you wanted the pacing for Root, the story it's telling for the war, and how like Oath. I remember you mentioned that you were actually a little disappointed that it was a bit too aggressive. Like it seemed everything
Mhm.
came down to battles a lot more, which I definitely agree after playing it.
Sure, sure.
And like, how do you look at that with Arc? Like, how do you make it so it's not simply, as you say, like you're not always doing. It's not just becoming a war game, even though it is a, I think, as you say, a very happy war game near the
Mhm.
end.
Well, I try to be a pretty critical reader of my own work. I think it's really important. At least I find in my own design practice, I really like reading negative reviews of my own work. Well, I don't know if I like it, but I think it's important, and I spend
Oh,
time
so
doing
that's
it.
why you wanted to talk to me because what I said about
Yeah,
Arc.
yeah. Well, no, anyone who bounces off a game, and there can be all sorts of reasons. I think that there's one genre of negative criticism where someone says like, "Well, this was not, a good fit for me. I didn't find it compelling. It doesn't work for my group." I think that's fine. And then there's another a group of negative reviews, which is I see what this person was trying to do, and I don't think they did it very well. And I think those are both fascinating and so useful because I'm making these games for a lot of reasons, but one of them is so that I'm hopefully trying to make things that resonate with people. And if something isn't resonating, that's really I want to know that because I want to sharpen my craft. And so I spend a lot of time. I usually tell people that no one is going to dislike my game as much as I dislike it when I'm working on it. And so when I'm reading a negative review, I'm always like, you're a compatriot in this land of disgust that I'm also living in. And we can both like critique it together. And I also think that that I also like the games that I'm working on. But I try to take I try to take the criticism very seriously. And so what ends up happening, and this is by way of answering your question, is as I am looking through these reviews and thinking about a game, I kind of, after I finish a game, I go through this several month process of kind of an informal postmortem where I think about like, what are the parts of the game that disappointed me? Where did it not like live up to the kind of experiences I hoped it would craft? And then when I go into the next game, I think like, okay, well, how can I actually fix that problem? I want like another attempt at answering it. And I don't often try to relitigate a game that is already done. I'm very fortunate in my design practice where I don't publish games that I don't think are good. Like
Mm,
I would not publish it. It's not that, and I've been very happy with all the games that I've made, and I make a lot of bad games. I just don't publish them.
mhm.
And I think it's very important that I kind of like have a kill switch even late in a project where I'll work on a project for many, many months and say like, actually, this game fundamentally uninteresting. I'm never going to be proud of it. I'm just going to flip the kill switch and say, no, it's not going to happen.
That makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, and I think this is a really, even in my historic games, I have a few historical games that I just, they function, they have rules, they can be played, but they don't. I'm not proud of them, and so
Mhm.
I don't push them through. But at the same time, as I'm going into a new project, I'm always thinking about the parts of previous projects that I thought I could have done a little bit better, a little bit sharper, things like that. And so ARCs is very much a kind of reaction and synthesis to previous work I've done at Leader Games. And it's a reaction to both Root and Oath, but also to the conversation around both of those games. So Root is really interesting in that regard because Root was never designed to be expanded. It's one of the funniest things about Root. Root was designed with really just the four factions in mind. And then when the campaign did really well and it looked like, okay, maybe there's room for six factions, we kind of built the whole game to just support those six factions. Now, there are now 10 factions in Root. There's 13 hirelings. They've got double powers. There's four boards. There's two decks. There's all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
We've got 8 automated factions. Um, and Root was never really built for that, but the audience kind of demanded it, and we were sort of happy. Like it's a good thing to have work demanded of you, right? There's like no greater gift than you can give someone to say like, "Hey, I really liked the thing you did, and I would like you to do more of it." It's just there's such generosity to it, but on the back end, I Josh and I had to go sweating bullets into the law of Root and reconstruct sections to get them to support the broader framework of the game. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about as I go into ARCs is what about building a framework that is designed to be adaptable and expandable and is actually like built so that if someone asks me to do more work in the world of ARCs, I am like delighted and eager to do it because it's like playing with Legos.
Okay, so I mean, I was going to ask, but you sort of answered it with the root thing. Like, how do you decide when you do that post mortem, so to speak, that
Mhm.
this is something I'm going to take into the next game, or is this something that should be an expansion?
Sure, sure. That is a great question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. I think there are when I'm building a game, I oftentimes think about it as determining rules of syntax. So I'm like designing a little language, and then and then the content for the game are utterances, short stories, novels written within that language, and that really creates the line because there are things that root can do that arcs can't, and there are things that arcs can do that root can't. And if I have an idea for root content, I will ask myself, am I having to build new language within the core game's syntax to describe this content? And if that's the case, then it's actually probably a different game. But if I can work with my existing tools, then I don't need a new game. This is like the difference between just using a level editor and like building a new mod, right?
Hmm.
And I think one of the interesting virtuous circles that has emerged with arcs is arcs was really born out of a tranche of ideas that I couldn't do in root and that I couldn't do in oath. So oath, I was like, okay, I want to see more games. So okay, the central idea of oath was it's weird that we have all these campaign board games that aren't designed to be campaign games.
Hmm.
Like the most successful campaign board game of all time, Pandemic Legacy, is not designed to be a campaign game. Pandemic is fundamentally a single session game, but it was very skillfully yoked to a narrative structure and it works great. And so I thought, well, okay, what if you just built a board game that was actually supposed to be a campaign game? And I spent a lot of time looking at Rob Daviau's Seafall, which I think tried to do it, but didn't
Hmm.
quite like see it through. And I think Seafall is like one of the most interesting interloculars for this because I think it's a really interesting design, but also that doesn't quite work.
Right.
Um, and I went into Oath thinking, okay, what if you actually built a game to be a campaign game? And what happened as I was working on Oath is Oath's conceit was this is an infinite campaign game. It never ends,
Hmm.
which is very exciting, but it also meant that like I had to make sure everybody was wearing like a belt and suspenders and was seat belted, 5-point harnesses, because the core game can't make itself unplayable.
Right.
And so for that reason that like there are all these walls, and so I had all these weird game design ideas that couldn't work in Oath because of the demands of Oath's conceit. And so I was like, oh well, maybe there'll be this future game, and that became Arcs. Now weirdly, I know this is a long answer, but now weirdly, as I'm working on Arcs, I'm finding ideas that don't work in Arcs, and I'm like, oh, actually they kind of work in Oath, and that's become the material for like an upcoming Oath expansion, which we'll do at some
So
point.
they accidentally feed into each other.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm mentioning that is I think that sometimes we get into our minds, everyone, that designs are building. It's like fully iterative, right? That like
Mhm.
Oath is Root 2.0 and Arcs is Root 3.0, and that we're all like progressing. But that's not really how it works. How it works is like Oath generates all these ideas. It's like made from the discarded elements of other projects. We generate all these ideas, and then there are some ideas that don't fit into Oath, and they form a new project. And that new project may fit ideas that spawn an additional different project, or that could be used as a root faction or as cards in Oath or something like that. And I think in that line, I really think about each of these projects as being like very insular, like their own. They are their own thematic and mechanical space, but they can inspire construction on adjacent spaces too.
It sounds a lot like to me they're almost like branches on an evolutionary path that somehow the other one's pressure could influence how the other one
Sure.
grows in a
Yeah,
way. Like,
like the designs themselves are like existing in an ecosystem, like a super
mhm.
ecosystem that's housing them.
And
Um,
I can definitely see that in your arc description. Honestly, it seems like a lot of the times there was I don't want to say an exact tug of war because there's definitely more than the two of like how Root and Oath would interact with arcs. Like you mentioned how if you don't know anything about Arcs, by the way, I realized we should have probably explained. Spacefaring game, campaign game, in which you start off all very similar, but by the end, depending on the paths you've chosen, you may end up very different. And as you stated in the design, that's more like root. It's a
Mhm.
start oath, end root.
Yes, and one of the key things about ARCs, I mean, I think there are a few key things. So one of them is it is a very fast, very punchy, lightweight chassis. It's like a very, I mean, if you want to see like a 90-minute eclipse, like a very like distilled, like punchy game. And you can just play ARCs just as the game. You could say, you know what, I like playing, I just want a 90-minute space game in my life. ARCs will get you. And then what we're doing is there's a very full campaign expansion, which is basically the second part of ARCs that, and all this will be available on the Kickstarter. And when you get the campaign expansion, it allows you to sort of like unlock the other way of playing ARCs. And the thing about the ARCs campaign that I want to like triple underline is a lot of campaign games these days, they advertise it's like a 20-hour campaign or a 10
I
session
wanted to
campaign
actually
or a
ask about this.
40, yeah,
Yeah.
or a 40-hour campaign. And that's great. Live your bliss, right? Like that's fine. But ARCs is not like that. ARCs is a 3-game campaign. You are playing a trilogy. And so it's got a first act, a second act, and a third act, and then it's done, and you can reset your game. And the reason why you might want to reset your game is because a lot of campaign games are totally pre-built. And ARCs uses this kind of emergent campaign system where the game has seeds that the players play and that are activating different plot lines. And those plot lines can be mixed in like thousands of ways. So it is a lot more like the kind of replayability you see in a game like Faster Than Light, where like, yes, you're going to hit certain story beats, but there's a lot of like almost quasi procedural generation. I mean, it is procedural generation, but it's procedural generation in the same way that like Oath is procedurally
Mhm.
generated by through the actions of the players rather than an algorithm.
No, I recently played through the Dark Knight Rises board game, which is really just 4 chapters. And when I finished that, I remember being like, wow, I actually finished a campaign.
Right? Yeah.
Oh. And what I liked about it and realized, and the reason why it's that many chapters is because they're basing off the famous comic book series, and they're like, look, the story, it's 4 books, that's what we're doing. And
Mhm.
I really appreciate it because then that I feel like instead of making it video games are I think are the ones who are currently very, very in a problematic space with this is like 100 hours kind of deal. Like
Yeah.
I like you said, I respect if you like that, but it also feels like if you played a lot of these open world games, which you bring up a little bit in your design
Mhm.
diaries, like you're just sort of a lot of it feels like just extra stuff. And it feels like you really want to make sure this is like the trilogy, the Star Wars first, second, third movie. So much so
Mhm.
that, and I'm really curious to see if you already heard some. I'm sure there's going to be some Kickstarter comments about this of like, why isn't it 1 player or 2 player? You said this is
Yeah.
three
Yeah.
and four,
Yes.
which I sort of okay with because I mean, how many times have we gone on Board Geek to be like, yeah, this game fits 1 to 5. You want 4.
Well, and I, so there are a bunch of reasons for it. So one of them is one of the key things about my development practice, and in fact, I would say the studio development practice at Leader Games, but then also my studio practice at Whirlia Games, is I am really interested in making games to be played. Now, that might sound like a really asinine or like goofy thing to say, but I think if you look around the marketplace, you see a lot of different reasons why people buy games. Someone who spends several $100s to get like every bit of content that's ever been made for a game, what they're buying, I mean, I always think about this as like me at the bookstore, where when I buy a book, part of what I'm buying is the lie that I'm telling myself that I'm going to have time to read this book. And so, we go into these big projects and we think like, oh, I want all the content because I want to imagine myself as someone who's going to play through all the content. But even in the way they're designed, it's amazing, like on the level of product, like how hard are they to set up? How many boxes do you need to open to set up the game? How many elements do you need to sort to set up the game? How hard is it to remember to set up the game if you haven't played it recently? And there are all of these barriers. I think that every game designer is confronted with uh, barriers to play. And so when we were going into the product design of ARCs, I mean, I looked at Root and I looked at Oath, and one of the things, and I looked at like PAX Premiere. I think actually one reason why Pamir has done pretty well is that it is a fairly heavy historical game, but has pretty few pieces, very few pieces, and it doesn't take very long to set up. So what we found was players who like Pamir, they play it a lot. And if you look at the games like Wingspan, and if you, I mean, even like the recent game Arc Nova, one of the things about Arc Nova and Wingspan is I think both of them like kind of jump at the table. Once you've played it once, you're like, yeah, let's run it again. Whereas there's a class of other games, and these are the games that tend to be huge Kickstarters with tons of content, where not a lot of thought was given to like how hard is this to set up. And that was actually a really important element of how Oath works. You know, Oath basically, I made like we had this gambit that we were making when we were working on Oath, which was players don't mind a complicated game as long as it's fast to set up. So like we're going to tell players like, look, this game's hard to learn. It's even hard to put away, but you set it up quickly. And I think that like I like thinking about things in terms of those gambits because then I can go to an audience and say, look, I'm really just interested in making games that get played. And like, yes, I want them to be beautiful and we want them to be like lovely projects that can be enjoyed even by players who might want to just experience them kind of like indirectly, which is a common thing. I mean, heck, I just got Mark Herman's Pacific War from GMT, which I will almost certainly never play because it is like a 10,000 hour war game. But I have read the rules and I have set up some of it and pushed some counters around. And I've been enjoying like watching some videos about it and like reading through the playbook. And I think that's a totally valid way to experience the game. But in my own design development practice, I want to design things that want to leap out of their boxes. I want to remove barriers. So when it came to the campaign design, I thought, okay, I think campaign format storytelling is one of the most powerful tools that tabletop games have for telling interesting narratives. But I think that a lot of people who work in tabletop design come from video games and they want to shock people with like long campaigns. And that is going to actually scare people away.
Yes, I
right. And for that reason, what do you need? Well, I need I want a 3-stage campaign. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is how do I guarantee that players get through that 3-stage campaign? It's got to be interesting. It's got to have hooks that push players into the next game where you in the game and you get something cool and you're like, oh, I want to use this thing. So I guess I want to play again. And then most importantly, it's logistically difficult to plan a game night. So if I design a 6-player campaign game, that's going to be hard to finish because now you're coordinating 6 schedules. And a 3-player campaign game is just easier to get to the table.
I feel you're talking to every D&D player out there with that.
Oh, yeah. No, and this is why, I mean, role-playing games are a great example because I find, the last role-playing game group I was in, which was many, many years ago, got too big. There were 8 people and everybody wanted to be there. And the campaign just ground to a halt. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to leave this group. And then I'm going to when I do role-playing, just do one-offs. Or if I'm doing a campaign, it's going to be with like my wife plus another person.
Right.
And we found that we were able to move through so much content and have so much for fun together. And this is why, someone told me like, I really wish Arcs was 6 players. We always have 6 at our game nights. And I was like, play 2 groups. Yeah. Like it's a great 3-player game. Just play 2 tables, liberate yourself.
I feel, first of all, you're calling me out on so many things as someone who collects trading card games, the kinds of guy backs too many of all the things, as well as, of course, when we have those 6-player, like we should split and we never do. But
well, it's hard. You want to see everyone. You want to hang out.
The other real big thing I want, because I feel like you put something in focus that I sort of have said but never realized. The difference between something like Gloomhaven, and not to call it out Gloomhaven only because it's very popular, versus like playing Destiny, a video game, is if I want to hop into Destiny, it's click, 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 go. Gloomhaven, I have to take it out of the box. I have to find the pieces I need. We got to put that aside. We have to assemble the map. The setup time, as you said, can make or break why people want to play things. And it really can't be something ignored. And I really liked how you put that into focus more, and because I do think that's something that can be not always appreciated, or even like, even like talking about how a game is packed away, if they don't tell you like how to pack away the game, especially if you just popped out of the chips and stuff for the first time.
Yeah, so can I call out some games?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, so Gloomhaven, first of all, I adore Isaac, and I really like Gloomhaven. I think it's a brilliant design, but that setup time is killer, especially because my wife and I started playing Gloomhaven when our second kid was born,
Hmm.
and we would like set up the game, and then the kid would start crying, and we're like, oh, well, I guess we'll just tear it down, try it again. And Gloomhaven Digital has reignited my love of the game because it is like click, click, we're in, and we're playing Gloomhaven. Now, I think when I was working on John Company is I just finished John Company. It'll be shipping in a few months. And one thing about it, John Company is a huge game. It's like one of the biggest games I've ever done. This is a big 5 hour, like it's on the level of like if you want Twilight Imperium, but you're wearing powdered wigs instead of being space cats, I got you. That's
Twilight
what I
Imperium
mean.
derezzed.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's just a gigantic game. It's in a really strange genre, which is like the heavy negotiation game. It's very historically grounded, but I made sure that the game was extremely easy to set up. So the way like the trays are designed is like it basically to set up the game, you take out the trays and then you put them back in the box. And like in that process, the game sets up itself. It takes for it's like a 6 hour game, and it takes it's not a 6 hour game. It's a 3 to 6 hour game depending on which scenario,
Hmm.
but it takes 10 minutes to set up. And I think actually the people I know who play 18xx games, one thing they love about them is like this is a big 5 hour strategy game. It's hard. It doesn't take that long to set up. You sort the tiles, you're ready to
Hmm.
go. And the point of contrast here is I think about games that have miniatures. So if you have miniatures in a game, and I like minis are fine. And in fact, arcs we will have a miniatures pack. But it's one of the things I find very interesting is when you're packaging those miniatures, you are oftentimes the default plastic vacuum tray that is holding them. Sometimes they have snap fit, and that snap fit is great for protecting the miniatures, but it's horrible for setting up the game because you have to like unsnap, 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 unsnap. And when I got Hero Quest, the new edition of Hero Quest, which I was
Hmm.
very excited about because I grew up with that game. And I saw those trays, and I was like, I set the first game, and I was like, skeleton, 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 skeleton. And I thought, this is stupid. And so I pulled out all the miniatures and I just put them in Ziploc bags.
No,
And
that's yeah.
it, and they're all banging around and they're going to get broken. And who the hell cares? Because that like I'm not displaying them in a glass case. And I think the other game that I would call out is recently I played a bunch of Merchants of the Dark Road.
Hmm.
I think it's a pretty interesting game. I'm not crazy about it, but I could see a certain group that would really like it. But the tray design of that game is one of the worst trays I've ever seen because it's just like I don't know if the development team who worked on that game ever set up the game and then put it away in the tray because it just doesn't lend itself to repeat plays. And I think there is a lot about that game that is like snappy, but to me, it seems like the kind of game, and I hate to call them out because I do think there's a lot that's admirable about it. But it is one of those games that after I played, I was like, I wonder how many times they like played this game physically. Like I'm sure they tested a lot in TTS. I'm sure they did a lot of like very careful like theory crafting. But it just like having everything out and having to like carefully set it up and go through everything. I'm like, I think that this just it is losing me at the really essential part. And so like, you know, I think there's a lot of clever things about Arc Nova. One of the most clever things about it is that they had the foresight to include some plastic trays for sorting the pieces because it turns what would be a very frustrating setup to a very fast setup. And it's just, it probably costs the production an extra dollar, but that is a dollar well spent because it is like putting it on people's tables.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing I feel like downtime is worse than long playtime.
Yeah.
And that's really the big issue. I'm getting a little annoyed because I want to just sit here for hours and talk, but I feel like we
Oh yeah, yeah,
get to
yeah.
Arc Nova. We haven't even
Next
gotten to the
question.
question I wanted to ask about the 1700 trick taking games that influenced Arc Nova.
Oh,
Maybe
sure,
for
sure,
another
sure.
time.
No. You can hit me wherever you'd like to talk about. I'll give shorter answers now. I just had to get all of that off my chest because we're in the thing is you're hitting me, Will, at a time when we are in the middle of the like core. So we're recording this right before the Kickstarter is launching, and we are finalizing a lot of the details about like the product design. And in these meetings, we're finding ourselves opening up games that we've gotten in the mail, like recent releases, and being like, what were these people thinking? Like these are industry professionals, and they're designing their products as if they are display pieces and not games to be played. And I think that shift, like, one of the most important pieces of advice I give sometimes to younger designers is reduce the number of pieces in your game, the number of piece types. Because when I open up a copy of Acquire from like 1963 or something, I dump out those chips and I get my little stack of hotel shares and my paper money, and that's it. And that is a fascinating, interesting, intricate economic game that basically only has one piece and then like a few different classes of cards. So I think it's and the thing that I would want to communicate to people about Arcs is that like Arcs is a massive game. It's every bit as big as Oath. Um, but we have tried in the fundamentals to say like, no, like Arcs is a game that you can like play the single session mode on a weeknight, and it's like easy to pack up, and it's easy to tear down, and it's easy to set up. And we like really have tried to attend to the fundamentals while at the same time designing like a very large game
Right.
that has a lot in common with a game like Gloomhaven or something.
Absolutely. And now I gotta ask this. I'm afraid this will also lead to a long answer. One of the things I had a problem with Oath is I love the way, honestly, when you said it takes a while to put the game back, but I feel like that's a whole nother game.
Yeah.
But in terms of the choose, like the end game of finding out who the winner is, in essence, when you're deciding, you're choosing your strategies. I never felt there was a reason for me, like there is carryover and maybe I could be a citizen, but
Yes.
I didn't feel like there's a reason for me to be a citizen to want that. When reading the Arc's description, it feels like you built in there the idea that like maybe I'm not gonna do the winning move for this game, quote unquote,
Right. So
but I can
yeah.
do this fun tech thing. Like,
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing about Oath, and this is one thing that I'm going to be, as we're expanding it, what I told folks about the Oath expansion that I'm working on is a lot of expansions are purely additive.
mhm,
And I don't want this to be additive because Oath is already a big lift. So I
mhm,
said, what if Oath is instead one branch of a larger Oath tree? And the expansion allows you to move back to the trunk and to different branches.
okay.
So it never gets more complicated, but it might become differently complicated.
Mhm,
And then, as one way of getting around, of getting to that, is to say, let's make the interphase, the intermission, the like after game teardown more interesting for all the players at the table. Because I think Oath gives a lot of power to the person who won the game
mhm,
to determine how things are going to go. I would like to divide that and to deepen it with the other players so that if you are losing a game of Oath, which I frequently am, there are some things that you can do that will really change the shape of the next game, and you can give yourself those little sub goals. So that's what the direction I'm hoping Oath will go into. Now in Arcs does that a lot more explicitly, and it gets away with this because the game state in Arcs is really a 12 or 13 hand game
mhm,
that has been divided into three smaller games. And what I mean by that is if you end the game with a large like fleet outside of the asteroid belt, at the start of the next game, it's still there, which means even like a move or a ship build or one last little battle, that is all setting the stage for the next game. If you started a siege at the end of one game, it's going to continue into the next game. I mean, and in that way, it feels a lot more like the way time passes, like in a Star Wars movie.
mhm,
And Star Wars, I think, has been a really interesting narrative touchstone. So it's funny. I feel like a lot of times when I play science fiction games, it's obvious they were all obsessed with Star Wars, which is a fine thing to be obsessed with. And they're always wanting to pull like laser swords and alien design and world building. And I'm like not really pulling any world building from Star Wars.
mhm,
What I am pulling are the formal characteristics of its narrative. So like Star Wars to me is, the action of the movie is going to be like a few days or like a week. But then in between the movie might be like a year, might be like 6 months. And so that kind of like weird, like temporal
time skip.
changes. Yeah, like those little time skips and like the way it does time, I think is fascinating, and that's what I'm trying to carry into Arcs. And so what will happen, what I love seeing happen in Arcs is players in Arcs, they have a main goal. When they're playing the campaign game, they have a main goal, and then they have a few sub objectives. And the main goal is going to unlock more content, which is exciting,
Mhm,
but doesn't necessarily like there is no winning. It's just do you want to unlock the content or not? And then the sub goals, the objectives are going to give you victory points. They're going to give you power. But in the and then during the last act, everybody will have a victory condition. And the way it works is if you get your victory condition, you win the game. If multiple players get a victory condition, victory points are the tiebreaker. Power points are tiebreaker. It's very simple. Um, and what is intriguing about this is that that's a lot to chew on. A new player will say like, okay, game one, my objective is to like construct this galactic library. I have to research it first. That's going to be tough. And then I also have these victory points I can earn, which I want to earn because that power is going to let me build special units, and it's a currency it's a metagame currency basically. Um, and neither one of those things is winning. Like the game does not use the language of victory to describe either one of those things, but there's a clear hierarchy. The game wants you to do your fate more. That's where your identity is. And then you also like victory points because it's exciting to earn points. But what I love happens in Dark is sometimes you get your butt kicked and you get really just ruined. And you say, okay, well, I can't do those things. But because my player position is like carrying over, I'm gonna start like doing other like sub goals because I'm just excited by these like other things that I might be able to do, right? And so it might be like, oh, I really like this ability, and I don't know what the next game is going to hold, but like if I could get this like matter converter, it could really open up my options in the next game. And so I love seeing players create these sub goals, and then that brings so much life into the longer stories that the campaign is telling.
Well, I really actually going back to the also the shorter campaign too, though, is I feel one of the problems that I feel in many campaign games something is like if I go down a path, let's say I went, I don't know, heavy ship,
Right.
and I realize that strategy isn't doing well, I feel bad if I can't quickly shift over. When I feel like this feels like I can follow this to its destination, see how it ends, but it's very easy to just boot up another campaign to see maybe what some of those sub options
Yeah.
during that. And I wish I noted which one it is. I do love that you mentioned how PowerPoints were how you were excited. Like, I finally have a reason to explain why you want victory points.
Yes, yeah, that is the one of the core conceits is like, what does a victory point mean? It's like, well, victory points in most war games that have victory points, that well, not war games, let's say empire games. Victory points are all about like legitimacy, continuity of rule, and like long scale power. That's what you're trying. Like, I don't call them victory points again; they're just called power, and they're called power because it's power. And it actually I had an interesting moment with John Company, which also has a power currency. And basically, players can earn power through these different means. And John Company, and someone said, power feels so like that's such a weird word. And I'm like, well, no, it is just power. Like we're talking about the ability to hire or fire someone. This is like a pure, unadulterated version of power. And what I like about power in the context of arcs is that like I'm talking about the same thing. Like, what do your victory points allow you to do? They allow you to maintain a giant army. They allow you to like keep all of these systems in tow, which means a big empire needs victory points to stay big, or it's going to start shrinking. And there's an interesting conversation that we're having right now on the development side, which is if a big empire gets big and then scores very little victory points, should they collapse a little bit? And that's like maybe I don't know yet. That's kind of like a post Kickstarter development question, but it's something I'm thinking about.
I'm really excited to see when Arc finally comes into being. Um, is there anything else you think that you really stands out with Arc versus maybe other games that you were shocked when you were designing it? Like
Sure.
impressed, like, oh, this I haven't seen it play a game like this way before. I'm really happy how it went with either player interactions or mechanics.
So I think one thing I was worried about is victory conditions are a really important narrative tool in design because they're like the script that you give all the players, and if players are all reading different scripts, the drama is going to fall apart, right? And so I use the victory points to orient the players, or I use victory conditions to orient the players. And I was worried about a game that like allowed and encouraged players to ignore victory points. Like, is that going to lose its tension? And that was one reason why Arcs is built around a trick taking format, because it really forces the interaction. Like there is no world where you're not paying attention to everyone at the table all the time. And I think that was the main, that was one of the main things I was interested in the design development. And then, one of the things that most surprised me about it is originally the trick taking format had this very elaborate draft. So you would like take your tricks, you're not really taking tricks, I should say, but like you're playing your action cards, and then you would be slowly drafting your hand of action cards for the next turn. And what we found was it was just too hard to think about. It was interesting academically, but it just scrambled players' heads. It scrambled my head, right? Um, and so what we did at one point was just say like, well, what if you just give players random hands of cards? Just like, who knows? Maybe you're playing like the warlord and you draw a random hand of cards and it's all peacenik cards and there aren't any war cards. Um, and and I was worried. Initially, I was very worried. I'm like, players are going to hate this. They're going to be so frustrated. But what I found was that it's exciting. When you are trying, you badly want to crush this system under the weight of your military might. And you draw a bunch of like production cards. And you're like, okay, I have a hand of production cards. I can't choose when this is going to happen. And so, let me dial it back a little bit. One of the core mechanisms of the game is that you draw these cards, and if you're leading tricks, you're determining like what the default action is. So I like, hey, I'm leading production. Now you could play if you have a battle card, you could play your battle card for a weaker battle. But maybe you want to produce, in which case you play your battle card face down. It becomes a weak production card. So you can take any action in the game generally. It's just if you don't have actions of that card, you don't get to choose when it happens. And that means a military player who has a hand without any combat cards, they can still fight. They just don't get to choose when they fight. And this creates so much drama. And it's like, it's cinematic because you're like, everything's in position, but we just need the order to attack. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, I can't attack because I need to wait until somebody else plays a battle card. And so you're like carefully sculpting your hand. And there's so much tension building up. And it feels like, a movie where the gate is slowly closing, right? Or a ship's like flying through a ravine. And what I found was, I think players, a lot of design practice these days is about giving players control and hiding randomness. All this talk about input versus output randomness, things like that. And what I found in ARCs is it kind of has allowed me to like build on an argument I'm making, which is in most media, we love adversity. We love to feel like the deck is stacked against us. But in games, we want to be patted on the head and rewarded for fulfilling our idea of like of our role as a hero in a drama. So I always use the example of like RPGs, right? Where it's like, hey, you didn't beat the troll. Why don't you just go grind some goblins for 2 hours? Then you'll be able to beat the troll. So there's always a way to advance. Like your character can't help but get stronger. There's no standing still. And ARCs is built on a very different narrative premise, which is you are always going to have bad luck. Like one of my favorite things about ARCs is when you deal the hands of action cards, everyone groans. Everyone's like, oh my God, this is horrible. Every hand feels bad in ARCs. And that it puts everybody into like the mindset of the underdog and allows all the narrative elements to click really seamlessly. Now, does that mean that the best player sometimes doesn't win? Yeah. But winning is like the least important part of ARCs.
Well, I remember reading that part. You brought it up in your designer journals, the groan, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I recognize that groan because I think there's two versions of it. There's the what I would similar in Magic the Gathering when you draw no lands, because that means you can't actually play. But I feel the arc groan, at least your description, sounds more like it's not the best hand, but you have a chance still. Like that.
Yeah.
That's why you said like you could do any action, you don't control it, but it's still possible. And I think that's important because that still leaves some agency to the players. And I know that's something I really like, or I guess things that bother me in a game when they don't give you that agency. That's when I think the randomness hurts. The randomness changes your maybe how efficient you can be, but not literally making it so you feel like I lost before I started.
Yeah, and I think this is one reason why I really wanted to package the game into 2 segments too, because I think that players. I think ARCs is every game I work on, I have the general, our general attitude is always like, I want to design someone's favorite game, but it's not everyone's favorite game. And so with ARCs, I said, if we put everything in $150 box, that's not really fair to anyone because it is such a strange game, and like you just might not be on the same wavelength as the game. And so the small box version says like, hey, play this, and you might hate it, and then okay, you're only out the small game, you can stick it on the secondary market or whatever. But if you love it, know that like this is a door to a huge world. And I mean, I think about that a little bit with like a game like the recent republication of Libertalia,
Hmm.
and actually just Libertalia generally. I love Libertalia. I have feelings about the republication. Um, Mostly, side note, my only problem with it is I think that the reputation track,
Hmm.
the variable income on the reputation track is too high. I think that the variance is too high. I think that the range should be like from 9 to like 11,
That makes
or
sense.
or it should be flat. And the reason why I think that is because I think that at one point in the development they tilted the reputation track
Hmm.
to make it so it wasn't too unfair. But then they built all of these cards that make it like it's actually kind of good to be at the bottom of the reputation track.
Hmm.
So that the reputation track, it's just, to me, it's a very the variable income is too arbitrary in a game that is otherwise so crafty. And like I don't want to be rewarded for having like a bad play position so that
Hmm.
our scores are artificially close. It's dumb. Anyway, everything else about the game is fabulous. But one of the things I like, the reason I'm mentioning Libertalia is Libertalia to me is a brilliant game that many players have very good reasons to hate. It's just, if you like people who like Libertalia like the mind games, they like the
Hmm.
weird comboing, they like really getting into each other's heads, and that's a very particular kind of flavor. That's going to turn a lot of people off, right?
Hmm.
Where and I could contrast that to some other Stonemaier games, like something like Wingspan, which I think Wingspan is an eminently likable game. You know, like maybe you wish that we had a little less luck, or maybe you wish it was more combo-y or was a little harder or whatever. But it's still like you're still on the spectrum with it. Like you still like it.
Hmm.
Whereas Libertalia is like some people are going to hate this, some people are going to flipping love it, and Arcs is like that, which is why it gets kind of like packaged in that small unit. The other thing I wanted to mention, just having to do with luck, is chance and risk and luck are, I think, really essential subjects in my design practice. All my games deal with risk in different ways, um, and I try to treat them with a lot of respect, and also to um, I try to do interesting things with them that I hope advance the form in my own small way. One thing about luck and oath is in Oath has a really funny element. This is just kind of an aside, but I wanted to mention it here,
Hmm.
which is that drawing cards in Oath is bad usually. Like drawing cards once is fine. Drawing cards a second time is like oftentimes pretty bad, but it might be the best. And so one of the things I like about Oath is that if you're in a really desperate position, it says like, go to the grab bag. Maybe you'll get the perfect card. And I think Arcs is interesting because players are going to be routinely in positions of really, really desperate weakness. And in that instance, it's like the game will ask them, instead of saying, like, the game doesn't have a mechanism that says, like, hey, you have a really bad hand. Here's this other like lever you can pull. So whereas an Oath, it's like, you just had a bad luck. Why don't you go pull the slot machine and maybe you'll get the
Hmm.
perfect card? Arcs doesn't have that. Instead, Arcs has the interface, has the intermission, which says like, "Hey, that was a rough hand. You really had a bad time there. Why don't you change your goals a
Hmm.
little bit?" And then, and I think that is just it's a powerful tool for coping with the luck. And where it runs into, I think it's trickiest spot. And this is something that we're still sorting through in development, is in that last act. So the very end of the game, the very last turn, you're right at the end, you've got to lock something away, and you draw a bunk hand. And you're like, oh, this hurts. And the way we're getting around it is by generally making the victory conditions a little bit easier. So then, like, drawing your hand becomes a referendum on a strategy that asked you to only complete your goal at the very last moment. It's like the kid who procrastinates on their homework and then they're like, "Oh no,
Why do you
I,
keep
I
calling me out?
I'm so sorry," but it's like you procrastinate on your homework, and then like you have to go to a movie that night, or like there's something happens, and you're like, well, that feels bad because I had a bad luck at the 11th hour, and it's like, well, no, what were you doing at the 10th hour? And I think that's the kind of logic that we're taking about when it comes to the overall. Yeah. So here's what I'll say about the Kickstarter. If you're interested in ARCs, as soon as the Kickstarter launches, you'll be able to play it. We'll have it available on Tabletop Playground, Tabletop Simulator, and in physical kits that you can download and print. It's a big kit. There are a lot of cards, but you can definitely play it right away. And then halfway through the campaign, we're going to be releasing the campaign mode as a Tabletop Simulator mod. For anybody who wants to explore it. It's a little rougher. It's not quite as polished as the shorter version, but if you just want to see the kind of crazy things that the game can do, we'll have all that available. One thing that I'll add about the Kickstarters that we run at Leader Games, we don't do exclusives, we don't do promos, there's no early bird specials. We really see these Kickstarters as like a place to inaugurate like a new community. Like this is us hitting the champagne against the boat as it's getting ready to leave, and say, hey, we're going to all make this game together, and if you want to come for the ride, like the boat is leaving the dock now. And so we try to treat these Kickstarters as a big party. The people who back it are going to get the best deals that they're ever going to get on the game. But even just for people standing by, like, know that if you've been interested in this game and you want to see what it's about, on May 24th, you're going to be able to jump right in with everyone else.
Well, I can tell you there's already a huge line waiting to get onto that, I guess, starship in this case.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, not nautical. I gotta go stellar with my metaphors.
And hopefully, I'm best of luck and wishes for the Kickstarter. Obviously, please check it out. Like you said, you can actually try it out once the Kickstarter goes live, and wait for the campaign as well. And of course, check out Oath and Root as well for all those other much more different but similar play styles. And if you want to go more historical, you have, of course, PAX as well as John Company. Is it John Company, or am I mixing it up?
No, you got it.
Yeah,
PAX
perfect.
Premiere, and then John Company will be shipping to Kickstarter backers hopefully sometime in the mid or late summer.
Great. All right. Well, Cole, thank you so much for joining me, everyone. Please check out all his games, and of course, read that designer discussion on Board Game Geek. You just go to the ARCs page. It's right there.
Yep, you'll find it.
Really interesting, and I think as of this recording, you still have one more entry to release.
I've got one more to go.
So there is some stuff even I couldn't even know about. So, but thanks again. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. And this has been Roll for Crit. Bye, everyone.
All right, take care. Thanks, Will.